Hello. Today I'm going to talk about this, the government's leaflet, why the government believes that voting to remain in the European Union is the best decision for the UK. It's probably going to be a long video because there's a lot to talk about, and I've got various other notes and stuff which I'm going to have to refer to because it's all a bit complicated. I've been trying to find facts, basically, and there's a lot of people talking, but there's not much in the way of facts. And one big problem with this whole thing is we're talking about what might happen in the future as a consequence of this or that decision. And of course, we humans don't have much access to knowing about the future, so it's a bit hit and miss. We just have to make our best guess and hope for the best, I suppose. But the thing is, we're going to be having a referendum soon. It's currently April. We're going to have a referendum in June about whether Britain should stay a member of the European Union. And David Cameron has negotiated with the European Commission a number of concessions to Britain should we stay in. And a lot of people have been quite critical that actually these concessions don't amount to much. And probably the best way to start is not actually with the leaflet, but with actually what is the agreement that we're going to be deciding about. Because if this agreement is sufficient, if this is convincing to you, then perhaps the vote should be to stay in. And I've summarised it on some bits of paper. I'll just read it, I'm afraid. I'll put a link below the video so you can download the PDF yourself if you want to look at what the actual agreement says. But let me just check you can hear me. Yes, I don't want to talk for an hour and then discover the microphone wasn't working. Okay. Okay, so let's go. There's a number of points. One is ever closer union. And they've agreed that it is recognised that the United Kingdom, in the light of the specific situation it has under the treaties, is not committed to further political integration into the European Union. The substance of this will be incorporated into the treaties at the time of their next revision. Okay. That's good for people who don't want Britain to be giving up more sovereignty, perhaps. But it should be said that it can still be done by regulation creep, just gradually increasing the encroachment bit by bit, without any deliberate decision being made. And there's nothing here to stop a future government, e.g. the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, for example, committing to ever closer union anyway. The referendum will bind the government for a while, but it's not permanent. The only permanent solution really will be pulling out of the EU, because there's no way we could go back in without a referendum, an EU agreement and more. So it's worth bearing that in mind with all of these concessions, actually. A future government, or even this government, could renege on them. And certainly so could the EU, because none of this is actually in legislation. In fact, although the Commission has agreed to this kind of vaguely worded document, that has to be ratified by the European Parliament, and it can also be challenged in the European Court of Justice. And as an aside, Britain has fought cases in the European Court of Justice on over 40 occasions since being a member of the EU, and the decision has gone against Britain every single time. So we have no say in the European Court of Justice, in effect. Okay, another concession. If 55% of national EU parliaments object to a piece of EU legislation, it will be rethought. Well, that's actually better. That is, I think, a reasonable reform. And if Parliament ratifies that, which I would expect it to do so, the European one, because it gives them more power. That's fair enough, because at the moment they only really have the power to throw out something altogether, or accept it wholesale. In-work benefits. This is what David Cameron's agreed. New legislation will provide for an alert and safeguard mechanism that responds to situations of inflows of workers from other member states of an exceptional magnitude over an extended period of time. The implementing act would authorise the member state to limit the access of union workers newly entering its labour market to in-work benefits for a total of up to 4 years from the commencement of employment. It goes on to say that the limitation should be graduated from an initial complete exclusion, but gradually increasing access to such benefits to take account of the growing connection of the worker with the labour market of the host member state. The authorisation would have a limited duration and apply to EU workers newly arriving during a period of 7 years. Now, just to clarify this, in-work benefits are working tax credits, housing benefits, and any other benefits that you can claim whilst you're in a job. Now, there's a number of points about this. First of all, most EU workers in Britain don't actually claim any of these benefits anyway. Only about, as far as I can tell from the figures, it's about 4%. There's a couple of million EU workers in Britain, and only about 84,000 of them are claiming these benefits anyway. So we're looking at a small number. Another point is that after a few months, or after, I think it gradually increases over a period of 4 years, so they do get access to the benefits. So it starts off at 0 and gradually ratchets up, which is reasonable, actually, for those that need to claim it. But, and here's the bad news, once this is implemented, it must stop after 7 years. Under no circumstances will it be permitted by the EU Commission to continue for more than 7 years. This concession is temporary. David Cameron, I think, wanted 13 years or something, but it's 7 years, and then this concession is withdrawn unconditionally. Okay, child benefits. A proposal to amend regulation whatever of the Council on coordination of social security systems in order to give member states, with regard to the exportation of child benefits to a member state other than where the worker resides, an option to index such benefits to the conditions of the member state where the child resides. This should apply only to new claims made by EU workers in the host member state. However, as from 1st of January 2020, all member states may extend indexation to existing claims to child benefits already exported by EU workers. The Commission does not intend to propose that the future system of optional indexation of child benefits be extended to other types of exportable benefits, such as old age pensions. So, member states, all of them, are going to be able to assign child benefit, not according to the country where the worker is, but according to the country where the child is. So, somebody from Romania at the moment can come here, and child benefit in Romania is something like £9 a month. They come to Britain, they can get £200 a month for that child again, and still leave the child in Romania with their relatives to be looked after. With this concession, the government can give them £9 a month rather than 200. So that's the idea. It doesn't apply to people who are already here, but it will after 2020, if we stay in the EU, and if Parliament ratifies it, the EU Parliament. Job seekers allowance. Newly arrived EU migrants are banned from claiming job seekers allowance for 3 months. If they have not found a job within 6 months, they must leave. EU migrant workers in the UK who lose their job through no fault of their own are entitled to the same benefits as UK citizens, including job seekers allowance and housing benefit, for 6 months. Well, I don't know what you think of that, but I think a limit of not being able to claim for the first 3 months is not really a big deal. The idea that they must leave if they've not found a job within 6 months is I think, quite a big deal, and it's rather contrary to Britain's ideals of freedom, actually. On the other hand, not only must they leave, but they're not entitled to job seekers allowance and housing benefit if they're out of work for 6 months or more anyway. So that will probably encourage most of them to leave without it being compulsory, actually. Well, I don't like that agreement, but I don't think it amounts to much. There's no mention, actually, in the deal of any agreement on social housing, whether they can get council homes or anything like that. But certainly for British citizens, getting a council home is pretty difficult because they're in short supply, and you have to be on waiting lists for years and years. You have to be practically sort of minority pregnant lesbian with 5 kids and no job, addicted to drugs or something, and then you can maybe get a council house, right? If you're a normal person, I'm afraid you've got little chance of getting one, even if you're on the list for decades. I guess that will apply to them too, but you never know how it will be interpreted by particularly left-wing councils who very much like to be politically correct. The Euro. Measures, the purpose of which is to further deepen the economic and monetary union, will be voluntary for member states whose currency is not the euro. So we don't have to join the euro. But of course, a future government might get us to join anyway. Certain parties are in favour of us joining the euro. So, agreement or no, we can join it if we want to, or if we do, we're in. So it's not binding on our government. City of London, he wanted protections for the finances or the money makers in the City of London. So this is what it says. The single rulebook is to be applied by all credit institutions and other financial institutions in order to ensure the level playing field within the internal market. To this end, specific provisions within the single rulebook and other relevant instruments may be necessary while preserving the level playing field and contributing to financial stability. Well, I don't know quite what that is all about, but I guess the finance people will understand it. I guess it's saying that the rules for the City of London will not be discriminatory either for or against them. And when the EU makes rules about financial institutions, it must ensure that they are fair for British institutions and companies and corporations. Because I think there have been some headaches about rules as they've been up to now. Competitiveness. To generate growth and jobs, the EU must enhance competitiveness. To this end, the relevant EU institutions and the Member States will make all efforts to fully implement and strengthen the internal market, as well as to adapt it to keep pace with the changing environment. At the same time, the relevant EU institutions and the Member States will take concrete steps towards better regulation, which is a key driver to deliver the above-mentioned objectives. This means lowering administrative burdens and compliance costs on economic operators, especially small and medium enterprises, and repealing unnecessary legislation as foreseen in the declaration of the Commission on a subsidiarity implementation mechanism and a burden reduction implementation mechanism, while continuing to ensure high standards of consumer, employee, health and environmental protection. The European Union will also pursue an active and ambitious trade policy. Well, it's great that they're saying we must do this and we must make the EU more competitive. But that's been the idea of the EU all along, and they have singularly failed to achieve it. And just saying, oh yes, we must do this, there's nothing concrete in there to say that they really will do it, or that it's definitely got to happen, that it's compulsory for them to do it. That it's like a best efforts. Oh, we'll make our best efforts. And they've been making their best efforts for years, and the EU is in a terrible state. They're not capable of it, I think. So it's kind of hot air, but it will give Britain a stick to wave over them and say, look, you've promised you're going to do this. But these, especially the southern European corrupt and uncompetitive and retarded countries, and the eastern ones, really, really do need to liberalise their business regulations a lot. They have quite a lot of worker protection laws, some of which are quite bad for business. France is living in like a trade union hell, Italy too. You know, you need to make the money and then dole it out, not the reverse, really. And these countries are in a bad way, and it's their own doing, really. It's politically impossible for them without perhaps the EU pushing them along a lot, and it hasn't been doing that. We've been in the EU for 40 years, and these countries are still chronic, and some of them are worse than they were before, in fact. So I don't really have any confidence in that particular measure achieving anything. But that's the agreement, okay? And so let's have a look. Here's the leaflet. Let's go through it, see what we can make of it. First of all, it tells us how important it is, that it's a big decision. They want you to vote, of course. They think it's very important that you vote and all that. Up to you. It says the UK has secured a special status in a reformed EU. No, it hasn't. Okay. There's nothing in legislation to say we have any special status beyond Margaret Thatcher's opt-out on some of the social chapter which Tony Blair went back on, and the refunds we get from our contributions. And it mentions a reformed EU. The EU is not reformed. Many people think it is unreformable because certainly Britain has been trying to make it reform for decades, and it's proven impossible. And I was just talking about how they haven't been able to get countries to liberalise their business regulations and make it easier to make money or start businesses. It can take you 20 years to start a business in Greece because of all the ridiculous hoops you have to jump through. You know. Okay, we will not join the euro, they say. This is one of the special statuses that we've reformed. That is a problem because we is undefined. What they mean is this Conservative government will not take us into the euro, but as soon as there's another election, they can change their mind. The next government can do it. This is not binding on future governments. It's not even binding on the current government, except that they would face a huge backlash if they went against whatever they promised. Provided people remember, we will keep our own border controls. I'll talk about that some more, but it's questionable. The UK will not be part of further European political integration. Okay, unless, of course, a future government wants it. There will be tough new restrictions on access to our welfare system for new EU migrants. Well, you've heard how tough these are. They're not very tough, and they're strictly temporary. 7 years maximum. Then it's all back to status quo. We have a commitment to reduce EU red tape. That commitment has been there for years anyway. They've reworded it here, but it's the same commitment. They've been trying to do it for a long time and have failed. I'm not finding it convincing so far. Let's get on with the next page. A stronger economy. It talks about how so many exports go to the EU. And it says over 3 million UK jobs are linked to exports to the EU. Now, I've spent a while researching this, and I'm very surprised that they've put this figure in here, because it is known to be spurious. It's well known to be spurious. What they have done is look at the proportion of our exports that go to the EU and taken the same proportion of jobs in the country and said 44% of our exports go to the EU, So 44% of jobs must be linked to exports to the EU. I think that's jobs in these industries, but it's still absolutely spurious. That's such a bad way to do statistics and analysis of the situation. It's literally guesswork. It's terrible, and it's misleading also, because supposing these jobs are linked to exports to the EU, when we vote in the referendum and supposing we decide we're going to leave, those jobs are not going to stop just like that. Just to look at the figures, we're exporting £227 billion worth of goods to the EU every year, but they are exporting £288 billion worth of goods to us every year. Neither side is going to stop that on a sixpence as soon as we quit, right? Anyway, quitting is going to take 2 years minimum. It'll take 2 years in legislation, but we might take longer negotiating things. I don't know. We can have interim agreements in the meantime anyway. All exports to the EU are not going to stop. They might reduce, but no way are 3 million jobs going to disappear. If exports reduce by 15%, even by their stupid reasoning, we would only lose, 15% of 3 million? What's that? Can't even work it out. 400,000 jobs maximum. It's probably less than that, actually. Am I talking about 40,000? 1% is 30,000. So 10% will be 300,000. So something like that, maybe. And that's if it all goes badly wrong. But the way it's calculated is well, you can see from that how stupid it is. And there's more to it anyway, because clearly the EU is not going to want to lose £288 billion worth of exports to us every year, so they're not going to cut us off anyway. There may be complicating factors, and there will certainly be some reorganisation needed in the economy. I doubt that even 300,000 jobs would disappear. I think it'll be much less than that, because deals will be struck. Furthermore, there are a number of changes in the economy that will happen. We can't predict with any accuracy exactly to what level they will happen, but there are certain factors that need to be taken into account. This leaflet says that we face higher prices if we leave the EU. Somewhere. What happens if we leave? Can't find it. I'm sure I'll find it. We'll come to it eventually. But it's possible because, for instance, the economic shock might cause the pound to fall, for example, against the dollar. It's already drifting down a little bit at the moment, apparently. I haven't looked it up, but I have no reason to disbelieve that. And if the pound falls, what that means is our exports get cheaper for other countries, which makes it better for our exporters, but our imports will go up in price. So the prices of some goods on the shelves would go up, probably food, for example. However, if we're outside the EU, we would no longer be subject to EU tariffs on our imports. Most goods imported into the EU are subject to tariffs which raise their prices. So the pound falling might act to raise prices, but when these tariffs disappear, that would act to lower prices. Which will be the bigger influence? We can't say. We would also actually no longer be subject to the Common Agricultural Policy, which artificially raises prices as well. So both of those influences would go, and prices may well come down. The EU might impose some tariffs on our exports to the EU, and this is where the reorganisation of business might have to happen. We would become a little less competitive in the EU. However, if the pound has fallen, we will become more competitive. There's also the complication of what happens to the euro. Because the euro is likely to fall. I think it's likely to fall a lot. Because Britain leaving the EU will be an absolute disaster for Europe. They depend on us so much. Britain and Germany are propping up Europe, basically, between us. So if we leave, it'll be mayhem for them. Their economy has been flatlining for a decade. No growth. Okay. Britain's, apart from the Great Recession, for which I blame our stupid politicians, it was a worldwide phenomenon, but it was well known what factors lead to such recessions and crashes, and the politicians who should have known better went ahead anyway with these kinds of rules. Anyway, just after the recession, we've been growing. We're one of the few countries in Europe that is actually growing. Unemployment in Britain is about 5%. The average in the EU is about 11%. So the economic shock overall might actually be a shock which is in our favour. It's very hard to say. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is forecasting that it will be a bad thing for Britain. We would lose some growth. We might even shrink. But it's a very esteemed institution, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. These are big, stuffy, international, highbrow institutions. But just about every forecast they've made over the last decade has been wrong. Humans do not know enough about economics to be able to make sensible predictions on these sorts of things. And all we can do is be empirical, if you like, scientific about these things and look at how effective their forecasts have been in the past. Their forecasts have been almost 100% wrong. Okay, so disregard them, I recommend. All we can do is try and figure it out for our own selves through some sort of common sense. There is no science which is able to get definite right answers on these questions, unfortunately. We are not advanced enough in our science to be able to do it. We simply can't. We don't know. All we can do is look at the factors and say, well, there are factors pushing in either direction. What will be the biggest influence? I don't know. Some jobs obviously will go, but new jobs will obviously open. So it may be a bit chaotic for a couple of years. The government thinks 10 years. I think they're overestimating that, because nobody's going to stop trade for 10 years while we negotiate agreements. That would be a mega disaster for Europe, much more so than it would be for us. Even though they only export 8% of their exports to Britain, roughly, some people say 16% of EU exports come to Britain, I'm not sure, but it's about £288 billion worth. They can't afford to lose that money. So there will be interim agreements, or the status quo will be maintained for a time, or something like that. No matter how angry they are at us wanting to leave, money talks. And the question of whether Britain could go it alone and negotiate trade deals with other countries, I mean, come on, we've been doing it for centuries. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. If any European country can stand on its own, Britain is the one. We would do better outside the EU even than Germany. Germany is making a big profit out of the EU, and is thereby keeping these poor countries poor, as it happens, because they're all buying German goods with money they can't afford. Because German goods are good quality stuff, as we know. So yes, Britain can certainly negotiate trade agreements with other countries. The US is our biggest trading partner, in fact, outside the EU. And The EU has been trying to negotiate trade deals with India and has given up. Over 7 years they've been trying to do that. I mean, India's a Commonwealth country. We will trade with them like that. We have culture in common, we have language in common, we have history in common. Same with Canada. They've been negotiating for years and years with Canada. Can't make a deal. It's terrible. You know, they're just about there, I think, with Canada. It doesn't take so long. Britain negotiates free trade agreements with countries quite quickly, historically. We're much better at it than the EU. The problem with the EU is it has to balance the interests of 28 different countries, and it makes it very, very tough. So we can expect some sort of economic readjustment, whether that will be a Great Recession or actually just a minor hiccup, nobody can say. We have to think about it. What would be the consequences? Supposing it was quite bad, and lots of us, maybe I would lose my job, lots of other people might lose their jobs. What would happen? We would get into debt. As individuals, the state will probably get into deficit position as well. But because our exports would undoubtedly be cheaper, the pound will certainly go down. Because people are scared. That's something which can fairly confidently be predicted. Our exports will be cheaper, so businesses could quite quickly reorient to be exporting to the rest of the world. And without the EU getting in the way and making these negotiations difficult, it would happen quite quickly, I think. So I would say don't be scared, really. Let's have a look, what else does it say in here? It talks about the pressure on the value of the pound and the prices may go up and so on. I've answered that, I think. EU reforms in the 1990s have resulted in a drop in fares of over 40% for lower cost flights, and from next year mobile phone roaming charges will be abolished across the EU. Well, these are trivial matters, frankly. Who gives a damn, really? And anyway, there are cheap flights to other parts of the world. It doesn't depend on the EU. It's disingenuous. So what else? What happens if we leave? Voting to leave the EU would create years of uncertainty and potential economic disruption. This would reduce investment and cost jobs. Well, it might, but it might not. Certainly there will be a reduction in investment in new jobs to start with, because companies of course will want to hang on to cash and just wait and see how it pans out. I think they're right to say that. But as I've argued, the reorientation might not be as bad as some people are saying. The government judges it could result in 10 years or more of uncertainty as the UK unpicks our relationship with the EU. Now, just speaking historically, the economies of the world are always uncertain. I'll move out of the sunlight, it's a bit bright there, I think. Ugh, we do that, alright. It's still shining on me, well, never mind. You get a big recession in the British economy every 5 to 8 years regardless of what happens, because politicians and economists don't know how to run economies safely. As I've said, the science is not well advanced, and they don't even follow what science there is anyway. So we have uncertainty whether we like it or not, and some of this uncertainty actually could be to our benefit, not necessarily, it's not all negative. It says, no other country has managed to secure significant access to the single market without having to follow EU rules over which they have no real say, pay into the EU, and accept EU citizens living and working in their country. Well, the EU has agreements with, according to one newspaper, I think it was the Telegraph, with at least 17 other countries outside the EU which do not involve free movement of EU citizens, in fact. So that's a very questionable claim. Certainly no other country in the EU has managed to secure it. That is, no other European country, as far as I know. They're thinking of Norway and Switzerland. And Norway pays something into the EU, not as much as Britain does, and it's a smaller proportion of their GDP as well. The reason you pay into the EU to be part of the single market is that the single market is run by a number of institutions, so you pay a fee to help pay for those institutions, basically. That's the idea, and it's not unreasonable. And yes, you have to follow some EU rules over which you have no real say. But Britain has no real say over the rules as it stands anyway. As I mentioned, we've been overruled more than 40 times by the European Court of Justice. Also, we've had 70 differences with the European Council, and every single time it has not gone our way. So we do not have a say over these EU rules anyway, in practice. And in terms of the European Parliament, remember we're only one of 28 states. We have, if you like, 1/28th of a say, basically. And it hasn't worked out very well for us. If we do leave the EU, of course, there are a number of other countries who are unhappy with it. Switzerland, France, Denmark, Sweden are all having problems with migrants. And we remember that Anders Breivik idiot who was shot up a load of people over in Scandinavia because of immigration problems. It's not just Britain that's finding it a strain. And of course, if we leave, these countries are going to say, interesting. Now, Switzerland has recently had a referendum where they want to limit the freedom of movement. It's getting too much for them too. But the EU has flatly refused to negotiate with them on it. They say you're in the single market or you're not in the single market. That's it. They can afford to do that with Switzerland. It's a small country. They can't afford to do that with Britain. £288 billion worth a year of goods. I don't think so. They're not going to cut us off. There will be a deal. They're just playing hardball with Switzerland at the moment because they don't want to encourage all these other countries to try and do the same, obviously. And they won't do it with us either unless we leave. Okay? It's a fundamental principle, and they're not going to shift it unless pushed hard. Now, there is another little aspect to the exports to the EU. Now, it says we export about 44% of our exports go to the EU, but in fact, it's not quite clear how accurate that is, because a lot of these goods go to Rotterdam, which they're then exported from Europe to outside the EU, where they count as exports to Europe. So we don't actually know what the figures are. Nobody apparently measured it properly. How many of these exports that reach Rotterdam, the port just across the channel, and how many of them stay in Europe and how many of them end up outside Europe. Also, British exports to the EU have been declining because the European economy has been declining for years and years and years. And if we leave the EU, we will be less subject to European corruption, to propping up their retarded economies. If they don't want to reform, and they don't really, it seems, or if it's politically impossible for them, why should we be responsible for that? We know how to run a country here, clearly. We've been doing better than them, even while we're in the EU, and certainly before, I think we can carry on. So let's have a look at some other aspect. I know this is going to be a long video, but I can't help it. There's a lot to talk about. 40 minutes already or so? Oh dear. I have a feeling the camera will just give up at some point when the file size gets too big. Securing our borders. The UK is not part of the EU's border-free zone. They mean the Schengen area. The Schengen area is the countries in Europe where you can cross the border and nobody checks your passport. You can just drive across. The same with England and Scotland. You can just go up there or go to Wales. Nobody checks your passport. It's just free movement. That's the Schengen area within Europe. The UK is not part of the EU's border-free zone. We control our own borders, which gives us the right to check everyone, including EU nationals arriving from continental Europe. And in fact, we do check everybody's passports on entering the country, but EU nationals cannot be prevented from entering. We can check the passport, make sure we know who they are, then we must let them in. Okay, so if they're a criminal, they can be arrested if they're wanted, and if the passport people notice. Okay. A lot seem to get in anyway. I mean, we only have 4 gunboats protecting the whole of our coast, so it's not that difficult to get in if you want to, you know. The government has negotiated a deal that will make our benefit system less of a draw for EU citizens. In future, new EU migrants will not have access to certain benefits until they have worked here for up to 4 years. Now, as I've already mentioned, this is actually very misleading. First of all, the deal will only last for 7 years. The certain benefits are the working tax credit, housing benefit, the in-work benefits. And it says they will not have full access to certain benefits until they've worked here for up to 4 years. That's right, it ratchets upwards as they stay here longer. But you have to read it very carefully to note that these gaps in the wording, and I think that's very tricky of them, you know. It makes me not trust them. Some argue that leaving the EU would give us more freedom to limit immigration, but in return for the economic benefits of access to the EU's single market, non-EU countries such as Norway have had to accept the right of all EU citizens to live and work in their country. They are a small country with not much bargaining power. As I say, 17 countries around the world have not had to accept the freedom of movement, in fact. We do want these citizens here, to be honest, the good ones. We do need the workers. But we just need to control the speed of it. It's a bit much. House prices in London are insane because there's too many people fighting over them. So I don't think they're speaking the whole truth here, again. EU membership means UK police can use law enforcement intelligence from 27 EU countries. There's no reason why that should stop. Since 2004, using the European arrest warrant, over 1,000 suspects have faced justice in UK courts and over 7,000 have been extradited. Well, it's not that difficult to come up with a way of arresting people, surely. I think we know how to do that. Even without a European arrest warrant, we can make a deal with the EU so they can arrest some of our criminals and send them back to us, and vice versa. I don't see what the difficulty is. We have agreements with countries all around the world on this sort of thing. And another thing it says here, actually, the UK is not part of the European border-free zone. We control our own borders. Meaning they can check the passports. If it's true, if I take it at its flat face-to-face meaning, on the face of it meaning, we control our own borders, then why is there an immigration problem? Either that is a lie, or it's a matter of deliberate policy. Take your pick. The sun's coming around on me, it's super bright now. There we go. Anyway, I should have a proper, when I'm rich I'll have a proper studio with fixed lighting. Right now I'm like Batman's Two-Face here. But that symbolises the difficulty of the decision. Should I be in or out? I don't know. Anyway, yeah, so we don't control our own borders, frankly. That's tripe. Now, let's look at what else to talk about. They say it's easier to keep terrorists or criminals out because of the European arrest warrant and all this, but it doesn't seem to be helping the Schengen zone people. Brussels attacks, Paris attacks, all this sort of thing. I don't know. So next, the benefits of EU membership. Security, that's peace, stability. I think they mean economic security. Yes, they do. EU membership brings economic security, peace and stability, it says on this page. Okay. Economic security, where their economy has been flatlining for a decade, where their unemployment is 11% compared with our 5%, with our economy growing, theirs not, with youth unemployment throughout much of Europe being something in the region of up to 50%. Is that economic security? No, it isn't. It is not. And if the EU keeps unpicking our businesses, then we won't have economic security either. It's worth pointing out that although the government said earlier in the leaflet that 3 million jobs were linked to the EU, they have failed to mention that the EU has actually lost a lot of jobs in the UK. The fishing industry, for example, the common fisheries policy has devastated the British fishing industry. You must have seen these stories on the news over the years about how they're having to shut down all these docks, and how fishermen can no longer afford to go fishing because of the policy, or the policy where if once they've caught their quota, they actually have to dump dead fish back in the sea. This has been known about for years and years as being a problem, and still the EU hasn't changed it. The energy industry has been made more expensive because of carbon taxes introduced by, I think, the last Labour government and under EU instructions. Coal, textiles, art, antiques, meat industries have all been badly harmed by EU regulations, which has made them less competitive. And there's been a lot of talk in the papers recently about steel at Port Talbot having to close down. But remember, it was the EU regulations brought in by the last Labour government about carbon taxes which made their steel uncompetitive in the first place. And it's allowing China to dump cheap steel into Britain, in fact, which is also not helping, because China has a bit of muscle and has negotiated something with them. Furthermore, the EU regulations are preventing the current government from saving the steelworks. I know people are blaming the Tories for this, saying, oh, they don't care, but actually they're not able to do anything much because of EU regulations, because they're not allowed to make our industries more competitive than other European industries, or other steel industries in Europe, because of EU regulations, right? So this devastation to certain industries has happened because of the EU. Do not take this at face value. The 3 million jobs are linked to exports to the EU, but manufacturing industry decline has happened largely because of the EU. The EU, the conspiracy theorists may not be right about actually what the purpose or what the plan is, but they are right to point out that our industry is being systematically unpicked bit by bit, because Britain is too powerful an influence in the EU, and still we can't get our own way, but we are a constant thorn in their sides, and the overall plan is to make it a single country, and they can't bring up the retarded countries, so they're going to pull down the good ones, and maybe not Germany, because Germany's at the centre of it all after all. It's their EU, really. Just look at what's happened to these industries and say, is the EU good for us? I don't think it is. The more I look into it, the more I'm favouring voting to come out. I'm a bit worried about economic shocks, but it's impossible to get a sensible prediction about what will happen. The influences, as I've mentioned, go both ways. So what are the benefits? Other benefits. We're going to keep the pound, hooray. We're not going to join the euro. Well, they might anyway, because that is the long-term plan for Europe. And sure, we can hang on and hang on and hang on, but once we've joined it just once, we're stuck. We'll have regulation creep, and eventually some government somewhere down the line will decide, oh, let's join it. And then we'll be tied into interest rates that are not under our control, regulations that are not under our control. Thank goodness we didn't join the euro when we did, because our economy would have been devastated, like theirs. So do we want to be tied into a Europe that cannot reform, whose economy is bad and just stays bad because they cannot reform, when we know we have a history of actually doing quite well in the world? And despite being a small island, we are, as I've mentioned, the 5th largest economy in the world. We surely can do all right, if anyone can. Benefits. There will be no transfers of power to the EU. Let's get the exact wording here. We have ensured that no UK powers can be transferred to the EU in the future without a referendum. There was nothing about that in the agreement that I saw. Maybe I missed it. But anyway, this is not written into legislation as far as I'm aware. It's just up to the government of the day whether they think, and it's just a convention, that they won't transfer substantial powers to the EU without a referendum. If they can do it without a referendum, they will. They prefer to get away with it. So that isn't binding. Certainly not on future governments. It's just a convention. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing in legislation. And also, powers can be transferred by regulation creep, where you just do it bit by bit. Just change a rule here, change a rule there, and before you know it, one little rule change means a lot has happened over 5 years. It's nonsense, that. David Cameron's promises are not worth much on that score, I think. We have full access to the single market with a say on its rules. Well, we don't have much of a say because we're one of 28 countries. We have a 28th of a say, and as I've mentioned, mostly we are overruled. Nearly all the time we're overruled. We've only got these minor concessions because we're threatening to leave. They could have given us these concessions before, but they refused again and again. So now we're threatening to leave. Well, all right, here's a little bit. Those will be taken away. They will be taken away. Some of them, it's written into the legislation, or not the legislation, it's written into the agreement that they will be taken away after 7 years. So it's I don't know. There is one though. EU membership means you and your family have the right to live, work or study abroad in any of the 27 other member countries. It also guarantees many employment rights. This is true. I mean, I would like to go and live in some sunny country in the EU one day, maybe. It's clouding over here now. I mean, this is Britain. Okay, rain, rain, rain. We even had snow in Britain the other day. This is spring it's supposed to be, but anyway. So yes, there is that. We have an absolute right to go to another country. They'll look at our passports, but let us in. And vice versa. And it's only fair that if we can go there, they can come here. But if we were outside the EU, we could still apply for a membership visa or whatever we would need, or we could maybe negotiate. And even if we're not in the EU, we could still have access to the single market. Remember, there is still the European Free Trade Association, which is a number of countries in Europe with free trade agreements with each other. We could join that. So we don't necessarily lose full access to the single market even if we do withdraw. That's worth remembering. The European Economic Area, the European Free Trade Association, these are all available to us whether we're in the EU or not. In fact, we don't lose much, in fact. And it would be relatively easy for us because already all our rules and regulations are harmonised with theirs because we've been in the EU. So in fact it would be a fairly simple, on the face of it, switch to make. Yes, they've kind of, in this leaflet, they kind of missed out talk of sovereignty. They say the UK is a strong, independent nation. Our EU membership magnifies the UK's ability to get its way on the issues we care about. No, it doesn't. It actually makes it harder for us within the EU to get its way. As I've mentioned, we've been overruled so many times. Maybe it helps to negotiate around the world, but actually we used to negotiate agreements with other countries all the time. So I'm sure we can do it again. And yes, if we leave the single market, we might have difficulty travelling to Europe, but I doubt it. I think the EU has visa-free arrangements with something over 170 countries around the world, actually. They might be reluctant to give it to us because we've been a pain and left, but it can be done. That's worth mentioning too, actually. Yes, sovereignty. We have a tiny say in Europe, and our industries and our influence are being slowly unpicked by EU regulations which work against us. If we stay in the long run, it looks like Britain will be worse off. We'll have less industry. Eventually our financial influence will be moved to Frankfurt because that's what the EU wants. This concession with the City of London will probably be worked around somehow by them in the end. Short term, there are worries, but medium term and long term, it's looking like we'll be better off. And I don't think this leaflet has been terribly truthful. It's kind of been untruthful by omission. Unless you go and search for the facts, you don't know. And I can't say with a definitive yes or no should we vote in or out. There really is no knowing what is the best thing. But given that the government has not been wholly honest with us in this leaflet, that just encourages me to vote against them. And given that Britain has a good trading history around the world, and Commonwealth nations will have the tariff barriers against them dropped, it'll be much easier to trade with them. We will not be hit as badly, I think, as many fear. There's bound to be some hiatus, but companies will adapt quickly, I think. They're saving up their cash already and the pound is dropping, of course. But that just makes our exports cheaper and makes it easier. So, have I missed anything out? Have a quick look through my notes. I don't know, that's pretty much what I've thought. Tell me what you think. Should I vote to leave? I mean, supposing I have some kids going to university now and will leave at the time they leave, will they have a job to go to? Will the situation be bad? Will it last? This is really important because I think a lot of people's decisions are based on, if you like, short-term panic. Will they lose their jobs? Or will they be better off? Long term, I think most people actually agree that long term we may well be better off out of the EU. The difficulty in most people's minds that I've spoken to has been what happens in the short term. Nobody wants to be unemployed if they've got a good job, or even a mediocre job sometimes. Will it be bad? Some companies are bound to be hit, but for some companies it's going to be an opportunity. It's so difficult because we just can't know what is going to happen and what will work for our benefit. How do we make this decision? Any ideas? Leave your comments. Like this video, please. Subscribe. Gotta say that, hey? Bye for now.